Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about variable scopes, and we're going to specifically be comparing the first focal plane scope to a second focal plane scope. And if you're scope shopping, this is a key word that's going to keep coming up, and it's important for you to know what it means and specifically what it means for you in terms of the way that you're going to be using your rifle. Okay, so a lot of times, first of all, when you're scope shopping, a lot of times you'll see FFP, that abbreviation. FFP stands for first focal plane, or SFP for second focal plane. Okay, so you may not say the whole word first or second focal plane. You might see FFP or SFP. So that's what it stands for. Now, most people that are coming new into this are going to end up with the second focal plane because it's just the cheaper option. Okay, so that's going to naturally attract them. But just because it's the cheaper option doesn't mean it's not the better option for them. In fact, it's the better option for me. I mean, I can easily buy any number of first focal plane scopes. I'm not limited financially, but the second focal plane is just better for the way that I use the scope. Okay, the first focal plane is ideal for situations where people are doing a lot of observation and communication with each other, and we're going to talk about why in a minute. So let's take a look at these reticles. So in first focal plane, okay, if you're in 8 times magnification, right? Let's say your reticle looks like a chevron, okay. If you zoom down to 1 power, this chevron is going to shrink down to a tiny little dot. Okay, so you can't see the chevron and all the stuff inside it anymore. You see a tiny little dot, and sometimes they'll put like these little German posts at the edge, so that as you zoom in, those lines become visible, and it kind of helps you find that tiny little dot in the center. Okay, and they're not always there, but they're sometimes there. All right. So now sometimes you might see a cross. So when you're in 8 power, right, you're going to see a cross with these tiny little lines over here that have a numerical value. Okay, and there's 2 different values they use. They'll use mils, and they'll also use MOA values. So these little lines have a specific value, and as you zoom down, they retain that value. Okay, but at some point when you zoom down to like 1 power, you're not going to be able to see those tiny little lines. All you're going to see is a tiny little dot. And if you're trying to use a scope like this to do like close quarter shooting, where you're doing like fast target acquisition, it's very hard to find that tiny little dot and get it on a man, especially if he's moving. Okay, so that's the issue with the first focal plane. If you intend to be doing a lot of like close quarter shooting or shooting against moving targets, especially inside of 100 yards, the first focal plane can be really difficult to work with. It can become very difficult to find that dot when you zoom down. Okay, so if you look over here, if you're an 8x, right, and that's what and here's your reticle. When you're an 8x, this is, let's say at 100 yards, this is what your man is going to look like in your reticle. So he's going to basically stand inside of your horseshoe. Okay. The same thing if you've got a cross, right? At 100 yards, you're zoomed in at 8x. Okay. Your man is going to be, let's say, the full height of that cross. Okay. However, when you zoom down to 1 power, right, and now you're like at 7 yards. Okay, that tiny little dot, right, is basically going to be just a tiny little dot that you got to find and get. Basically, the man relative to the dot is going to be that big, right? So you got a big man here with a tiny little dot. Same here, you get maybe you got these little hash marks here that'll help you, find it and get it on the target. But this reticle has shrunk down to a tiny little dot that you got to find and get on your target. Okay. Now in second focal plane, right, the reticle stays the same. So at 100 yards, if I'm in 8x, my man looks like this, right? So you got a small man that will fit inside of the horseshoe over here, right? But if you go down to 1 power, you can still see the horseshoe. The horseshoe has not shrunk to a tiny little dot. It's the same, it's exactly the same size. And what happened is your horseshoe will now fit inside of your man's chest. So this horseshoe, let's say at 7 yards, is going to be from like here to here. So it's basically a big circle dot that will fit. So this is, so with second focal plane, it is really easy to find your reticle, okay, and get it on your target at CQB distances. Whereas with first focal plane, it's really hard to find that tiny little dot that has shrunk, okay? Now, like I said, with first focal plane, the main benefit is as you shrink this down, the value of these little lines over here stays the same, okay? So they have the same value, whereas that's in first focal plane. In second focal plane, when you zoom back out, right, these lines lose their value. They have no value. Now the dot or the chevron that you have in the center, that's still accurate, right? That the point, right, that you use to 0 is going to maintain its value from 1 power all the way out to X power. It's just that all the lines underneath it, you know, as when you zoom back from 8 power, because you zoom in at 8 power, as soon as you, let's say, move to 7 power, those lines have now lost their value. They have no numerical value that's of any significance. And as you go all the way down to 1 power, in fact, you know, one of the things that I'm very careful to caution people with the second focal plane, right? Because normally you'll zero this in, like the one I have, you'll zero in at 100 yards with the tip of the chevron on the bullseye, okay? So here's the thing: if you zoom back out to 1 power, right? If you try to, let's say, use this, you know, in 1 power, if you put this bottom line over here on your target, right, this tip is going to be like way up in the sky over there. And if you shoot a bullet, you're going to like send it over into the next town, okay? So you got to be really careful. You can only use these little lines over here when you're in 8 power, okay? When you're in 1 power, don't use them, because if you try to use them, you're going to send your bullets way high over your target, okay? So that's an important safety issue that that I always have to make people aware of, because that's one of the things that it's not something that seems to get enough attention. Okay? This is a potential danger thing. In 1 power, do not use these lines here, because your bullet's going to be going way high. Okay, so here's the thing: given that information, can I use 3 or 4 power at all on this scope, right? Because up here, like if you go from 8 power to 4 power, these lines have the same value. Well, like I said, in 3 or 4 power, the tip of the chevron itself, or the dot, whatever you have, that's still accurate. So what that means is, inside of 200 yards, right? Because from zero distance all the way out to, let's say, 200 yards, I'm using the chevron anyway, right? That's what you put on your target. It's only when you're shooting it past, like at 300 yards plus, that you start using all the other lines underneath it. So at, let's say, at 50 yards, right? Now I can shoot 50 yards in 1x, but what if I want to, like, observe, what somebody has in their hands, okay? Or if I want to zoom in like that, see, do they have a gun? Do they have a knife? Do they have a radio? Do they have a beer can, right? So I can use 3x or 4x to zoom in at 50 yards or at 65 yards over there where I have my target, okay? And again, I'm using just the chevron, which is accurate. And by being at 3x instead of, let's 8x, I still have a wide field of view. So that works really good. So that's a way that you can use the in-between values. Because normally when people think of using a single focal plane scope, they're either in 1 power or they're in like max power, wherever it is on the scope. Well, there's also those in-between powers that you can use the way I'm describing to observe. You can look and see, you can zoom in a little bit to see your target a little bit better, but still have a wider field of view. So right now I'm shooting 50 yards over there. Right, I'm in 3x. Okay. So I can move. I can get on target fast. Right, you guys can hear the hits, right? So if I was doing that in 8x, I'd be losing my target, right? Because I'm going to be too zoomed in, where I can't find it fast enough. In 1x, I can obviously see it, but I don't have the benefit of zooming in at all to see what they're doing, what they're holding. So if I get into 3x or 4x, I have that wide field of view, and I can see the target a little better. I can actually move and shoot. I can't do that in 8x because I'm gonna lose my target. So that's a way that you can use a second focal plane scope, and it's a benefit. It actually works a little bit better because if I was in 3x with the first focal plane, this reticle has really shrunk down. Okay. And if I get into the 1x, it becomes a tiny little dot. So the question now becomes is, why does anybody want to use first focal plane? Well, the key to first focal plane is the numerical value of these little lines. Okay? And usually the people that use first focal plane, they prefer this type of a reticle because it is a way to communicate, especially if you're working with a team and you've got, let's say, like a spotter and a shooter working together. They're both looking through their own scopes, and the spotter can say, hey, go to that rock that's sticking up out of the ground over there, and then go like 4 mils to the right, or whatever. So, and then they both know that they're both looking at the same thing because they have the benefit of all these little lines. Okay, and also as they're working with different calibers. It just, because here's the thing, the bullet drop, this type of a reticle over here with the bullet drop compensation, it's usually for a specific caliber, okay, or calibers that are going of the same velocity. If you're going to a much faster or much slower velocity, basically you got to kind of recalculate what this means. So for them, it just makes sense to just go to a mil reticle and just start like fresh and like just create data from the beginning rather than starting with the data that this thing was created with and intended for, right? Because this is intended for a certain type of caliber, usually a 5.56, and then trying to modify that, let's say, to a 6.5 Creedmoor or something, so that's why or 6.8, whatever it is. I don't shoot Creedmoor, so I don't know. So that's why for sniper type of guys, first focal plane is the better option usually, because they're shooting different calibers that aren't as common sometimes, and they're shooting at further distances, or even if they're not shooting further distances, because they might be observing something that's like 2,000 yards away, 3,000 yards away, without the intention of actually shooting it, but maybe they're conveying that information to somebody else. So that's why the first focal plane makes a lot more sense for the sniper kind of guy, whereas I think the second focal plane makes more sense for the like designated marksman kind of guy, okay, which is kind of like where I see myself fitting in, because I generally when I'm shooting, I'm not communicating with other people, okay, I'm shooting on my own, picking my own targets and hitting them, okay. So that's why for me it just makes more sense to stick with the second focal plane, and I got the benefit of that bigger reticle that doesn't change size if I'm shooting 7 yards or shooting 100 yards or 300 yards, especially in those close quarters, right? I want to be able to find a big horseshoe and get it on my target and kind of use it as a red dot, okay? Because when in CQB distance, right? If my man is this tall and my horseshoe relative to my man is that big, I can use this as a red dot to put on his chest and shoot. If my reticle looks like that, that's hard to find and put in center of the man. So second focal plane, I get the big horseshoe, a lot easier to find and put it on my man. And most of the time, I'm probably going to be working in that 1x power. All right, and I'll probably keep the scope. I normally keep the scope in 1x, okay, because that's where I intend to do most of my shooting. And then if I want to go to 8x, then I'll dial it up, take that shot, and then immediately come back down, because most of the time, like I said, I'm shooting this kind of distance. Okay, so a couple of things for you guys to think about. And like I said, most people think of the first focal plane versus second focal plane as the first focal plane being the more expensive one, second focal plane being the cheaper one, and that's how I initially was thinking of it. And I was like, okay, well, eventually I was thinking to myself, eventually I'm going to graduate up to a first focal plane. But as I got more and more into the variable scopes and the way that I use them, right, the first focal plane simply will not work for me because that tiny little dot in 1x doesn't help me very much. I need that big horseshoe that I can put on those targets, at this type of a distance and be able to quickly hit them. So these are some things to consider, as like I said, most of you guys are going to be starting out in second focal plane, but, think about this before you get it, you start going towards a first focal plane, because for most people, I don't think it's going to be the best option for them. Okay? So anyway, let me know what you guys think. If you got different ideas, please post them below. I'd like to hear from you guys, and I will talk to you soon.